He was standing near the edge of the busy street, leaning slightly against the cold metal railing, watching the world move around him. People walked quickly, talking on their phones, carrying shopping bags, or simply lost in their own thoughts. He had a kind of calm in him that seemed almost impossible in such a crowded place. But there was also a tension in the way his eyes followed every movement. He did not trust easily, and his life had been shaped by caution and control. Every step he took, every word he spoke, was measured. He had built walls around himself so high that almost no one could reach him. That morning, he was thinking about work, deadlines, responsibilities, and all the little things that could go wrong in a day. He had no idea that today, something, or rather someone, would change everything for him. She entered the scene as if she belonged to a different world altogether. She moved with a lightness that seemed almost effortless. Her smile was not flashy, but it had a warmth that made people look twice. It's the kind of smile that could make a rainy day feel brighter. She did not notice him at first. Not really. She was laughing at something her friend said, holding a coffee cup in one hand, her hair slightly messy in the morning breeze. But when she did glance in his direction, her eyes met his for a brief moment, and she felt something she could not explain. He was not like anyone she had seen before. He had a presence, quiet but strong, the kind that drew people in without them realizing it. He noticed her too. He noticed the way she moved, the lightness in her step, the way her eyes sparkled with curiosity. There was something almost reckless in the way she approached life, something that made him uneasy and yet intrigued him at the same time. He could feel a warning in his chest, a voice telling him to keep distance, to not get involved. That voice was strong in him because he had learned the hard way that people could hurt you, people could disappoint you. The less you let in, the safer you were. But still, her smile lingered in his mind long after she had walked past. A few minutes later, they found themselves in the same cafe. She had chosen a small table near the window, sunlight spilling over her notebook as she jotted down notes. He was there for his usual coffee, the same one he always ordered, the same seat he always took. When he saw her again, something stirred inside him, a mixture of curiosity and irritation. Why was she here? Why did her presence make his mind wander in ways it had not in years? He told himself. It was foolish, that he needed to focus. But he could not help noticing the small details, the way she tapped her pen against the notebook when thinking, the faint hum of her laughter even when alone, the way her eyes followed the rain hitting the window outside. Their first real interaction happened unexpectedly. She had dropped her pen, and it rolled towards his feet. Without thinking, he picked it up and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed slightly, and he felt a sudden jolt, like an electric shock that startled him more than it should have. She smiled at him, that simple smile, and said thank you. He nodded, his usual words failing him. Something in her gaze made it hard for him to maintain his usual composure. He wanted to step back, to remind himself of the rules he lived by. But the warmth of her smile made him hesitate. She sensed his tension immediately. It was not something she could put into words, but she could feel it. Most people were either too cold or too loud, but he was different. He was guarded, precise, and yet there was a vulnerability he could see if he looked closely. Instead of being put off, she felt a challenge, a playful one. Without saying much, she smiled again, not arrogantly, not teasingly, just a smile that seemed to say she was not afraid. She was not trying to break him, but somehow she already was. He tried to return to his routine, ordered his coffee, sat at his table, and tried to focus on the newspaper in front of him. But it was impossible. His eyes kept wandering back to her. She seemed completely unaware of the effect she had, writing in her notebook, sipping her coffee, glancing occasionally out the window. He told himself firmly, enough. Do not get involved. He had rules. He had boundaries. But every time she laughed quietly to herself, or tilted her head while thinking, he felt his walls crumble slightly. A few days passed, and by some coincidence, they kept running into each other. At the bookstore, she was browsing the same section he was, reaching for the same book at the exact moment. He muttered something, a warning almost. Do not test me. She looked at him, her eyes twinkling with mischief, and smiled. That smile was like a key turning in a lock he did not know existed. He felt a strange mixture of irritation and attraction, the kind that confused him completely. He knew she was not trying to hurt him, but she was poking holes in the defenses he had spent years building. One evening, they found themselves in the park. She was sitting on a bench feeding the birds, and he was walking past, trying to clear his mind after a long day. She looked up, waved, and beckoned him over. His first instinct was to refuse to keep walking, but something made him stop. He approached slowly, unsure of what to say. She greeted him as if they had been friends for years, laughing lightly at some minor joke he barely understood. And just like that, he forgot the stress of the day, the meetings, the deadlines, the rules. Her presence made everything else fade, and he hated that he liked it. The more they met, the more he realized she had a way of understanding people without needing explanations. She noticed his pauses, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way he held his coffee cup too tightly when he was nervous. And instead of judging him, she simply smiled and let him be. Her presence was not overwhelming, but it was impossible to ignore. She made him laugh in ways he had not in years, made him think differently, and made him feel emotions he thought he had buried long ago. One day, she asked him why he always seemed so serious, why he never joined the fun with colleagues or friends. He wanted to brush it off, say it was none of her business. But he found himself explaining, hesitating, telling her about responsibilities, about pressure, about why he could not afford mistakes. She listened without interrupting, nodding gently, never judging, never mocking. And for the first time he felt seen, truly seen, by someone who had no reason to care, but did anyway. Her laughter and warmth became something he looked forward to. Even when he tried to convince himself otherwise, he noticed the little things, how she remembered details about people, how she carried herself with confidence, how she seemed unafraid of life's uncertainties. And despite the warning he gave himself, do not get involved, he was involved. Not fully, not yet, but enough that he could not ignore it. He remembered the first words he had ever said to her. That almost instinctive warning, do not test me. At first, it had been defensive, a way to keep her at a distance. But now, thinking of those words made him laugh quietly to himself. She had already tested him in ways he did not expect. Not with cruelty. Not with confrontation, but with a smile, with presence, with gentle persistence. And somehow, he could not stay angry. He could not stay guarded. It's not when she existed in the same world. Their encounters continued like this. Small moments that seemed insignificant, but built up over time. A shared umbrella on a rainy day. A coffee bought for him without asking. A joke that made him laugh until he could not breathe. Each moment chipped away at his walls. Each smile, each gesture, each glance made him forget the strict rules he had lived by for so long. And he hated that he liked it. Hated that he needed her presence to feel something more than just control and order. By the end of this part of the story, he was changed without realizing it. He was not in love yet, not fully aware of what was happening. But he was curious, drawn in, affected in ways he could not ignore. Her smile, her lightness, her gentle challenge to his world had begun to make him forget everything else. Stress, the rules, the caution, the control, and that was just the beginning. Days passed, and their paths kept crossing in ways that felt almost like fate. It was not planned or forced, but each meeting left a mark on him he could not shake. Sometimes he would see her in the quiet corners of the bookstore, her fingers gently tracing the spines of books as if feeling their stories through touch. Other times, she appeared in the small park near his apartment, laughing with children, or quietly reading on a bench under the shade of an old tree. Every time, he tried to ignore the pull, telling himself to stay focused on his own life. But it was becoming increasingly difficult. She had a way of noticing things others overlooked. One morning, he arrived at the cafe, exhausted from a restless night, his thoughts tangled with work and responsibilities. He was tired, irritable, ready to spend the morning alone. Then he saw her sitting at the usual window table, notebook open, pen moving smoothly across the page. When she looked up and smiled at him, it was not a casual smile. It was a recognition, a knowing glance that made him feel like she could see straight into him. He felt the familiar warning rise in his chest. Do not test me. But this time it was harder to hold on to. There was something about the way she carried herself, the ease in her presence that made the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. He walked over and ordered his coffee, trying to act casual, but he could feel her eyes on him the entire time. When he finally sat down at his table across from her, she tilted her head slightly as if studying him, and asked a question about the book he was pretending to read. The conversation started small, almost mundane. She asked what kind of work he did, and he gave a short, clipped answer, careful not to reveal too much. She listened anyway, nodding, making small comments that made him feel like he was being understood rather than judged. It was subtle, but every word she spoke chipped away at his carefully maintained walls. He had built his life around order, predictability, and control. And she was a whirlwind of spontaneity that made him question why he had ever valued strict rules over moments like this. Over the next few days, their interactions grew more frequent. Sometimes she appeared at places he frequented, not in a deliberate way, but enough to make him notice. She seemed to have an uncanny sense of timing, always there when he was feeling tense or tired, offering a smile or a small word that made the heaviness in his chest lift, if only for a moment. It was frustrating and wonderful all at once. He had no idea how she did it, but she seemed to understand him in ways he had never allowed anyone to understand him before. One afternoon, she invited him to walk with her along the river. He hesitated, telling himself he had things to do, work to finish, responsibilities to attend to. But her smile, gentle and persistent, broke through his resolve. He found himself agreeing, and as they walked side by side, he felt a strange sense of freedom. He noticed the way the water shimmered in the sunlight, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant laughter of children playing. She pointed out small details, a bird perched on a branch, a flower growing through a crack in the pavement, and he realized he had been missing these small joys for years. Caught up in his own rigid routines, she spoke in a way that was easy and natural, not forcing anything, but gently encouraging him to let go of control, to experience the world without fear of making mistakes or being judged. He found himself laughing at things he would normally have dismissed, smiling without reason, and feeling a warmth in his chest that he could not name. Every step with her was a challenge, not in the sense of confrontation, but in the sense of testing his old habits, making him question why he had spent so long building walls instead of opening doors. He noticed how she treated others, with patience, kindness, and subtle humor. She was never loud or boastful, but people naturally gravitated toward her. He realized that he had always been so cautious, so careful not to reveal too much of himself, that he had missed the simple pleasure of connection. Being around her made him see the beauty in small interactions, the value of noticing, listening, and responding with warmth rather than calculation. One evening, as the sky turned a soft shade of pink, she asked him why he never smiled in the mornings, why he always seemed so burdened even when the day had just begun. He tried to brush it off, saying it was nothing, but she pressed gently, not insisting, just curious. He found himself talking, hesitating at first, then slowly sharing pieces of his life, the pressures he faced, the way he had built his routines to avoid disappointment, the way he had trained himself not to trust easily. She listened with a quiet intensity, nodding, making small comments that made him feel like he was being heard for the first time in a long while. He realized that this was not just about attraction or curiosity. Her presence was changing him, making him question the very foundation of his life. He had spent years protecting himself, avoiding risk, keeping emotions tightly controlled. And here she was, without any demand, without any expectation, simply being herself, gently guiding him toward a softer, more open version of himself. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. He started noticing how much he looked forward to seeing her, how the anticipation of their next encounter made his day brighter. His mind, usually occupied with lists, deadlines, and caution, began wandering in ways he could not control. He thought about her smile, the way she laughed, the little quirks that made her uniquely herself. He hated that he was affected, hated that he allowed himself to feel, but he could not stop it. Every interaction left a mark, and he found himself quietly hoping for more. She, on her part, seemed completely unaware of the effects she had on him, or at least she pretended to be. She continued to live her life with lightness, noticing small joys, interacting with people around her, sharing laughter and warmth. Her actions were simple, uncalculated, but they had a profound impact. She made him forget his anger, his stress, his rigid rules. Being around her was like a pause in a chaotic world, a space where he could breathe without judgment, where he could exist without fear. Their growing bond was subtle, built through small gestures and shared moments rather than grand declarations. A coffee offered without asking, a book recommendation, shared laugh and an unexpected joke, a walk in the park where silence was comfortable. Each moment was a test, not of will or patience, but of the heart. He found himself wanting to pass that test, wanting to be present, wanting to be open. Even though it scared him. One rainy afternoon, he found her waiting under the shelter of a large tree. A small smile on her face despite the downpour. She offered him an umbrella, and for a moment, he felt something shift inside him. He realized that he did not want to walk away, did not want to retreat into his usual defenses. He wanted to be near her, to experience the moment fully, without overthinking or controlling it. And so, he took the umbrella, walked beside her through the rain, and let himself be guided by her ease, her lightness, her quiet joy. He began to notice changes in himself, small but undeniable. He laughed more freely, spoke more openly, and allowed himself to feel without immediately analyzing or controlling the emotion. He was aware of the transformation, and it frightened him. He had spent so long relying on control, on rules, on emotional walls, and now he was learning to trust, to let go, to experience the world through someone else's warmth and perspective. Even when alone, he thought of her often. He remembered the way she had smiled at him when he first handed her the pen, the way her eyes seemed to see him fully without judgment, the way she had gently challenged him without forcing anything. Those memories became a source of comfort, a reminder that life could be lighter, that connection was possible, that he did not have to face the world entirely on his own by the end of this part. He was not in love yet, but he was changing. He was learning that life did not have to be a series of strict rules and careful calculations. He was discovering that a single person, through kindness, warmth, and gentle persistence, could make him forget the rigidity he had clung to for so long. He realized that she had begun to break through the walls he had built around his heart, and though he was still cautious, he could not deny the pull she had over him. The subtle challenges she presented, the small tests of patience and openness were shaping him. She was teaching him, without words, that life was meant to be experienced, that joy could be found in small moments, that connection was worth the risk. He knew he could resist, that he could retreat into his old habits, but he found he did not want to. Something about her made him curious, made him willing to explore parts of himself he had kept hidden, parts he had thought were lost forever. And so, he walked beside her through life's ordinary moments, feeling the extraordinary in each one. He laughed when she teased him, sighed when she challenged him, and felt warmth when she smiled. The lessons were subtle, the changes slow but undeniable. And in that slow, quiet way, she was teaching him to forget his old fears, his old anger, and his old need for control. He had been warned, told himself, "Do not test me," and yet she had tested him every day, without cruelty, without confrontation, simply by being herself. She had made him question, reflect, and slowly, without realizing it, he had started to forget everything else, all the burdens and walls he had carried. And it was just the beginning of a journey he did not yet understand, but could not wait to follow. The days seemed to pass differently now. He noticed it the moment he woke up, a quiet anticipation stirring in his chest, even before he remembered why. The world did not feel as heavy, as controlled, as rigid as it had for years. He had begun noticing things he had always ignored, the soft rustle of leaves in the morning wind, the distant hum of traffic that had always annoyed him, the way sunlight fell across the floor in patterns that shifted with the day. And somewhere deep in him, he knew it was because of her. Her presence had begun to change the way he experienced life, slowly, subtly, like water wearing down stone. She appeared one afternoon at the small park where he liked to sit and read. She was leaning against the railing, sketchbook in hand, absorbed in her own world. When she looked up and saw him, she waved lightly, and he felt that familiar tug in his chest. He walked toward her, careful not to show how much her attention affected him, and sat on the bench beside her. The silence between them was easy, natural, comfortable. He could feel the old tension that had always lived in his shoulders begin to melt, replaced by a quiet curiosity, a willingness to just exist in the moment with her. She spoke first, asking about the book he was reading, and he found himself talking more freely than he had in months. Words flowed naturally, without the usual careful editing, and he realized he was laughing softly at jokes she made about the characters, at the little observations she shared about life. She had a way of noticing things he had never seen, of pointing out the beauty in small, ordinary moments. He felt lighter with her, as if some invisible weight he had carried for years was finally being lifted. As they walked along the path by the river, she talked about small things, clouds, the way the water reflected the sunlight, a bird landing on the railing nearby. And yet, even in these small moments, there was a depth to her words, a way of seeing the world that challenged him without confrontation, that invited him to question his own ways of thinking. He noticed how tightly he had held on to his routines, his walls, and how much he had missed because of it. Her lightness was not careless. It was intentional, grounded, and it made him rethink the way he lived. She laughed at something he said, a quiet, warm laugh that seemed to echo in his chest. He caught himself staring at her, at the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, at the way her hair moved in the breeze. He felt a strange tension inside, a mixture of frustration and admiration. She was challenging him without ever asking him to change, without ever forcing anything upon him. And that was the part he could not resist. He wanted to rise to the challenge, to meet her openness with his own willingness, even though it scared him. They started meeting more often, by coincidence, or perhaps by a subtle intention on her part. Sometimes she was at the bookstore, flipping through pages in the poetry section. Other times she was in the cafe he frequented, sipping coffee and jotting notes in her notebook. And each time, he felt the same pull, the same curiosity, the same sense that life had become just a little richer, because she was there. He was aware of the changes within himself. He laughed more, listened more, noticed more, but he was not yet ready to admit that he enjoyed her presence more than he had ever thought possible. One rainy evening, they walked together under a shared umbrella. The streets glistened with rain, and the city seemed softer somehow. He felt an unusual sense of freedom, a willingness to let go of the tight control he usually demanded of himself. She walked beside him, quietly pointing out reflections in puddles, patterns in the wet leaves, small things he would have ignored without her guidance. The rain was not annoying as it usually was. It was beautiful. It was all because she had changed the way he saw the world. There were moments of tension, too. He caught himself bristling at small things, at her teasing, at the ease with which she challenged his routines. And yet, even in those moments, there was an undeniable attraction, her gentle persistence forced him to face parts of himself he had avoided for years, the fear of losing control, fear of being vulnerable, the fear of being seen as less than perfect. And slowly, he began to accept that perhaps vulnerability was not weakness. Perhaps opening up was not dangerous. She noticed the change in him, though she never pointed it out directly. She simply smiled when he laughed at her jokes, offered a hand when he stumbled on uneven pavement, listened when he spoke in moments of rare honesty. She did not demand trust. She did not insist on confession. She merely existed, and that existence was enough to teach him patience, to teach him openness, to teach him that life was not only about control. One evening, he found himself confiding in her more than he had ever confided in anyone. He told her about the stress at work, the constant feeling of responsibility, the quiet loneliness that had always accompanied his structured life. She listened intently, nodding, her eyes soft, her smile gentle. She did not offer solutions or platitudes. She simply listened, making him feel heard, making him feel that his life, his feelings, his worries mattered. That was new to him, and it was overwhelming in the best way. She shared small pieces of herself, too. She spoke of dreams she had, little hopes and plans, not in a boastful way, but in a way that invited him to see her world. He found himself fascinated not just by her words, but by the way she carried herself, by the way she embraced life with quiet courage. Every story she told, every detail she shared, was another thread weaving him closer to her. He could not deny the pull she had on him, even as he fought the impulse to resist. Their relationship grew in a quiet, unspoken rhythm. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic confrontations, only the slow building of trust and connection. He learned to anticipate her presence, to look forward to shared moments, to notice the little things that had always escaped him. She taught him that happiness was often hidden in the ordinary, that laughter could be healing, that a single smile could change the course of a day. One afternoon, as they sat together watching the river flow, she handed him a small sketch she had drawn of the scene. It was simple, beautiful, full of life, and he was struck by the care she had taken to capture it. He realized that she saw beauty where he had only seen routine, that she found meaning where he had found monotony. And he began to wonder why. He had spent so long living in a world of rigid control, when there was so much to experience if he simply let himself feel. There were moments of awkwardness, too. He sometimes struggled with how much he should reveal, how much he should participate, how much he should allow himself to be changed. She never pushed. She simply allowed him space to decide, trusting that he would find his own way. That trust, rare and unearned, began to soften him, teaching him patience, humility, and courage. He began to understand that the walls he had built were not protection, they were isolation. And slowly he let them crumble. Her presence challenged him daily, not with confrontation, but with simplicity, warmth, and a gentle insistence on living fully. She made him forget his frustrations, forget his fear, forget the rigid rules he had always followed. He noticed how he laughed more easily, spoke more openly, and found joy in small things, a bird landing nearby, a shared joke, a quiet moment of connection. These were lessons he had never learned in classrooms or from colleagues, lessons that mattered more because they were lived. Not told. By the end of this part, he had begun to change in ways that scared him and excited him at the same time. He still had fears, still had habits he could not fully break, but he found himself willing to try. The pull she had on him was undeniable, the curiosity she inspired unstoppable. She had begun to teach him not only about life but about himself, about courage, about joy, about trust, about connection, and he realized that no matter how much he had tried to protect himself, he could not ignore her, could not resist the transformation she was bringing into his life. He remembered the first time he had warned her, "Do not test me," and now he laughed quietly to himself. She had tested him every day, but not with confrontation or challenge. She had tested him with patience, with warmth, with presence, with the gentle power of being truly herself. And he could feel the difference in his heart, in his mind, in the way he now saw the world. She had begun to make him forget his old fears, his old anger, his old need for control. And even though he was not ready to admit it, he knew this was only the beginning. He had been challenged, softened, drawn out of his rigid life, and he wanted more. He wanted to continue learning from her, growing with her, feeling the world differently, seeing life through her eyes. And for the first time in a long time, he looked forward to the next moment, the next smile, the next shared step along the path she had opened for him. The morning air was crisp, carrying a faint scent of wet earth from the previous night's rain. He stepped outside his apartment, expecting another day of routine, another day of work and obligations. But somewhere deep inside, there was a subtle anticipation, a pull that he could no longer ignore. He found himself glancing around, almost hoping to catch a glimpse of her. It had become a pattern he could not shake. She had begun to occupy a space in his mind he had thought was closed off to others. Her presence lingered like a soft echo, a reminder that life could be more than schedules, rules, and responsibilities. When he finally saw her at the corner cafe, sipping coffee and looking at the world with quiet amusement, his heart skipped a beat. She waved at him casually, as if their connection had always existed and needed no explanation. He walked toward her, feeling the familiar mix of nervousness and excitement. She looked up as he approached, smiled softly, and gestured to the empty chair beside her. He hesitated, then sat down, suddenly aware of how much he valued these moments. These small interactions that felt heavier than any conversation he had had in years. The conversation began slowly like it always did. She asked about his plans for the day, and he gave brief answers, trying to appear casual, trying not to show how much he had come to depend on these shared moments. But she had a way of drawing him out without pressing, of inviting him to share without demanding. Slowly, the walls he had built around himself began to feel less permanent, more porous. He found himself talking about small victories, minor frustrations, details of his life he had never considered worth sharing. She listened with patience, responding with thoughtful observations that made him reflect on himself in ways he had not before. As they spoke, he noticed the subtle changes within himself. He was laughing more easily, smiling more naturally, and even when she was quiet, her presence alone made him feel lighter. He realized that he had been carrying tension for so long that he had forgotten how it felt to simply breathe without burden. She had not asked him to change. She had simply shown him that change could happen slowly, through small acts of connection and understanding. And in that realization, he felt both joy and fear. For he had no idea where this new openness might lead. Their afternoons together became a rhythm he cherished. Sometimes they wandered through the park, talking about nothing in particular. Noticing the patterns of sunlight through the trees, the birds hopping along the paths, the way the wind carried laughter from children playing nearby. Other times, they sat in the cafe, exchanging small details about their days, observing the world around them, sharing quiet jokes that required no explanation. Each encounter chipped away at his old habits, his careful control, and he found himself leaning into the ease of her presence. Letting go of the constant vigilance he had maintained for so long, she noticed the changes in him too. Not in a confrontational way, but through her quiet attention. The way she responded to his moods, the gentle encouragement in her words. One afternoon, as they walked beside the river, she pointed out a flower growing through a crack in the pavement. He laughed quietly at how something so small could be so resilient, and she smiled at him, her eyes full of warmth. He realized that she had been teaching him lessons about life all along, not through lectures, but through example, through observation, through shared experience. There were moments when his old caution resurfaced. He sometimes worried that he was letting himself feel too much, that he was losing control, that he might be vulnerable in ways that could hurt him. She never pushed him or judged him for these moments. Instead, she simply allowed him to take his time, to observe, to consider, and to choose. Her patience became a lesson in itself, teaching him that trust was not immediate, that openness could be gradual. And that connection was worth the risk. One evening, they found themselves on a quiet street lined with tall trees. The sunset painted the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, and he felt a strange stillness in his chest. She spoke softly about her day, about small joys and minor frustrations, and he realized he was listening differently. He was not analyzing, not calculating, not planning his next move. He was simply present, taking in the sound of her voice, the rhythm of her words, the subtle gestures she made as she spoke. He felt alive in a way he had not in years, and the realization made him both exhilarated and nervous. She had begun to see parts of him he had hidden from everyone else's fears. His insecurities, the weight of responsibilities that never seemed to end. He shared these details, slowly, carefully, testing the waters of trust he had long avoided. She never judged or offered easy solutions. She simply listened, asked gentle questions, and smiled in a way that reassured him he was not alone. He began to understand that vulnerability was not weakness, that opening up did not make him fragile, and that human connection could be a source of strength rather than fear. Their bond grew in quiet ways. A shared umbrella on a rainy day, a laugh over a trivial joke, a thoughtful question about a book or a poem, a subtle gesture that conveyed understanding without words. Each moment reinforced the sense that their connection was unique, valuable, and transformative. He noticed how he had begun to anticipate these interactions, how they had become the highlights of his day, and how he felt a sense of loss when they were apart. For the first time, he realized that life could be richer, more vibrant, and more meaningful when shared with someone who understood without demanding, who guided without controlling, and who cared without insisting. She challenged him in ways he had not expected. Not with confrontation, not with pressure, but with presence, with observation.
Oh.
With the gentle insistence that life could be lived differently. He noticed how he laughed more freely, how he observed small details that had once escaped him, how he felt joy in ordinary moments. She had begun to change the way he thought, the way he felt, and the way he approached the world. And though he sometimes resisted, he could not deny the pull she had on him. One afternoon, as they sat by the river watching the reflections of the trees on the water, he spoke about his past, about mistakes, regrets, and choices he wished he could undo. She listened quietly, offering no judgment, simply a presence that made him feel safe. He realized he had never shared these thoughts with anyone, had never allowed himself to be seen in such a raw way. And yet with her, it felt natural, unforced, and freeing. He felt a release he had not known he needed. A lightness that came from simply being understood and accepted. She taught him the power of small gestures, offering a hand when needed, laughing at minor mistakes, noticing beauty in unexpected places, sharing moments without expectation. He began to see that life was full of opportunities for connection and joy, and that these opportunities were often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone willing to notice. Her influence was subtle but profound, reshaping his perceptions, his priorities, and even the way he felt about himself. There were quiet moments of tension too. He sometimes questioned whether he was ready to fully let go, whether he could trust himself to feel without fear, whether he could risk vulnerability. She never pressured him. She simply allowed space, giving him time to process, to reflect, and to choose openness on his own terms. Her patience became a mirror, reflecting his own growth back to him, showing him that change was possible, that connection was possible, and that joy was not something to be feared. By the end of this part, he had begun to transform in ways that startled him. He laughed more easily, smiled more naturally, and felt a warmth in his chest that was unfamiliar but welcome. He realized that he had been living with walls so high that he had forgotten how to experience life fully. She had begun to tear those walls down gently, carefully, without forcing him, showing him that connection, joy, and openness were not threats but gifts. He remembered the first time he had said, "Do not test me," and now he understood the truth. She had tested him every day, not with anger or confrontation, but with patience, understanding, and gentle persistence. She had made him confront his fears, question his routines, and explore emotions he had long ignored. And though he was still cautious, still learning, he could not deny the impact she had on him. She had begun to change his life, quietly, profoundly, and irrevocably as the sun dipped below the horizon. Casting long shadows across the park, he looked at her and realized something important. He was no longer the same man who had warned her to stay away. He was softer, more open, more willing to feel. And though he did not yet understand the full extent of the journey ahead, he knew that he wanted to walk it with her, step by step, learning, growing, and discovering life in ways he had never imagined possible. The morning air was soft and warm, carrying a quiet promise of something different. He walked down the familiar streets, his mind unusually calm, a stark contrast to the way it had been months ago. He noticed small details, the way sunlight reflected off windows, the gentle sway of branches in the breeze, the faint sound of birds singing in the distance. Life felt different now. He had changed without realizing it at first, slowly, gently. Through countless small moments shared with her, she was already waiting at the cafe. Seated at the same table by the window that had become their place, she looked up when he entered, and their eyes met. Her smile was calm and easy, the kind of smile that seemed to hold understanding and encouragement in equal measure. He felt the familiar pull, the strange mix of excitement and nervousness, but it no longer weighed him down. Instead, he felt a quiet confidence, a willingness to be fully present, to be himself, and to trust the moment. Their conversation began as usual, simple and flowing. She asked about his plans, and he shared them without hesitation. He noticed the ease with which words came to him, the freedom in his expressions, the way laughter came without effort. She listened, nodding, smiling, occasionally offering a comment that made him reflect but never pushing. It was in these moments, so ordinary on the surface, that he felt the depth of their connection most clearly. She had taught him that life was in the little things, in noticing, in being fully present with another person. Later, they decided to take a walk along the river. The path was quiet, shaded by tall trees with the water flowing gently beside them. He realized how much he had learned to notice, how much he had begun to appreciate things that once escaped him. She pointed out a small bird perched on a branch, the shimmer of sunlight on the rippling water, the distant laughter of children playing. He smiled at her observations, and she laughed softly, the sound making his chest feel lighter. She had a way of guiding without forcing, teaching without lecturing. She challenged him not with words, but with presence, patience, and gentle insistence. He had begun to let go of old habits, of the constant need to control, of the fear of being vulnerable. He realized that he could trust her, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it by simply being herself. Her calm, persistent kindness had opened doors he had long kept closed as they walked. He found himself talking about things he had never shared with anyone else's past struggles. The loneliness he had carried, the mistakes he had made. She listened without judgment, without offering advice, unless he asked. Just being heard by someone who truly cared was a revelation. He realized how much he had craved this connection, how much he had avoided it for fear of being hurt, and how rare it was to find someone who could see him so clearly without exploiting or judging him. There were moments when he still felt uncertainty, flashes of old fear and caution, but she never pressed him. She waited, gently encouraging openness, demonstrating through her own actions that vulnerability could be safe. He had begun to understand that trust was not immediate but gradual, and that allowing oneself to be seen was not weakness, but courage. She had shown him that life could be rich and meaningful, and he was learning to embrace it step by step. One evening, as the sun began to set, they found a quiet bench overlooking the river. The sky was painted in soft shades of pink and gold, and he felt a sense of calm he had never known. They sat together in silence for a few moments, simply watching the reflections on the water. Then she spoke softly, asking about his thoughts on change, on life, on what he wanted for the future. He realized he could answer honestly, without fear, without pretense. He told her that he wanted to live more fully, to trust, to feel, and to embrace life as it came. She smiled at him, and it was a smile that said everything words could not capture: pride, warmth, encouragement, and quiet joy. Over the next few days, their bond deepened even more. They continued sharing small adventures, learning about each other in ways that were natural and unforced. He discovered her little habits, the way she found beauty in ordinary things, her quiet courage, and her infectious optimism. She noticed his growth too, the way he laughed more freely, the way he observed the world, the way he engaged with life, without the old fear and rigidity. Their connection was no longer about testing boundaries or breaking walls. It was about mutual understanding, trust, and shared joy. One afternoon, they were walking through a crowded market. He noticed how she interacted with others kindly, attentively, without expectation. She helped a small child reach for a fruit, smiled at a vendor, and shared a quiet joke with a passerby. Watching her, he realized how much he had changed. He had become more patient, more observant, more willing to engage with the world without fear. Her influence had been subtle but profound, shaping not just his perception of her, but his perception of life itself, the small lessons she had taught him, the importance of noticing, the value of laughter, the strength and vulnerability, the joy of shared moments, had become part of him. He found himself acting differently, approaching challenges with calm, seeing beauty in ordinary things, and opening himself to connection with others. And through all of it, she remained a constant presence, guiding without forcing, challenging without confrontation, teaching without words. There were still moments when he caught himself thinking about the past, about the walls he had built, about the caution he had always relied on. But those moments were shorter now, fading quickly in the warmth of her influence. He realized that the old warning he had once given, "Do not test me," no longer applied. She had tested him in ways that mattered, and he had passed not by resisting, but by opening, by trusting, by letting himself feel. One evening, they found a quiet hill overlooking the city. The lights twinkled below, and the sky was darkening into a deep blue. He felt a profound sense of peace, the kind that comes from understanding, from acceptance, from connection. She sat beside him, her presence calm and steady, and he realized he did not want to be anywhere else. He wanted to stay in this moment, to experience it fully, to hold on to the sense of clarity and joy that had grown between them. He reflected on the journey that had brought him here, the first time he had warned her, the small moments of laughter, the gentle challenges, the shared walks, the quiet conversations. He realized that every step had been meaningful, every interaction had shaped him, and every smile had opened a part of his heart he had long kept closed. She had made him forget the rigidity, the fear, the anger, and had replaced it with trust, joy, and hope. As they sat together, he felt the final pieces of his old self begin to dissolve. He no longer felt the need to control every detail, to guard every emotion, to protect himself from connection. He had learned that life could be trusted, that people could be trusted, that joy could be embraced. And the person who had taught him this was beside him, not demanding, not controlling, simply existing as herself, with warmth, patience, and quiet strength. The night deepened, and the city lights reflected on the water below. He looked at her and realized that he had forgotten entirely the man he had been before she appeared in his life. The old fear, the old anger, the old need for control, all had been replaced by a willingness to feel, to trust, to live fully. She had not only made him forget the past, she had changed the way he saw the present and the future. He reached out, taking her hand gently in his. There was no urgency, no demand, no pressure, just connection. She smiled, and in that smile, he saw everything he had learned, everything he had felt, and everything he hoped for. The journey had been slow, quiet, filled with small steps, small gestures, and small lessons, but it had led him here, to a place of understanding, trust, and openness. As they sat together, watching the lights flicker in the distance and the water flow beneath them, he realized that life had changed in ways he had never imagined. She had entered his world, not to disrupt it violently, but to transform it gently. She had made him forget the old rules, the old fears, and had shown him a new way to live, a way that was richer, fuller, and more joyful. And in that quiet moment, with her hand in his, he understood that the story was not just about learning to trust someone else, but about learning to trust himself. She had made him forget the old limitations he had imposed on his own heart, and in doing so, she had given him the greatest gift of all, the freedom to feel, to connect, and to embrace life without fear.